Welcome to The Coaching Corner, a podcast for coaches coaching in the child welfare field. I'm your host, James Coloma, and on today's episode, we'll be talking about solution-focused questions. In a moment, Bill James will join us on today's episode to help us understand more about this topic. I'm James Coloma, and we'll be right back. Welcome to the podcast, Bill.
Hey, good to see you, James. I'm glad to be back.
Good to see you, too. So tell me, what is your history with solution-focused questions?
What is my history with solution-focused questions? Solution-focused therapy has been around, sort of percolating for really the last 50 years. Got started back in the 60s and 70s. Was really pioneered by Steve DeShazer and Insu Kim Berg at the Brief Family Therapy Center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And it certainly is a topic that was covered when I went through my master's in social work degree back in 91, 92, 93 timeframe. And I distinctly remember taking a class that it covered solution-focused therapy. I then went to work for a child welfare agency here in San Diego County in 1993. And in the rush of investigating referrals and writing court reports and complying with all the mandates and this and that and the other, I'll be honest with you, within about 5 years, I'd forgotten what solution-focused interviewing even was. I was, doing my best by families, and I was relatively successful at helping families reunify, but the culture of child welfare didn't really reinforce skillful use of solution-focused interviewing until safety organized practice and signs of safety came on the scene about 4 or 5 years ago. Now, I've been involved with some other practice improvement efforts in my office around motivational interviewing and some other strategies. But the application of solution-focused interviewing to child welfare casework it really is a great fit, and it's really been a professionally very rewarding to get my staff and the workforce that I've been working with and the folks that I've been coaching reacquainted with this very foundational interviewing style.
All right. So tell me, what is a solution-focused question?
Well, solution-focused interviewing is based on the concept that the things we pay attention to tend to flourish and tend to grow. And despite the fact that, all of our Medi-Cal billing, all of our reasons to file petitions, all of our reasons to get involved with families usually center around problems. If we take the time to focus on solutions, ask parents and families and children and the network what kind of solutions they see that might apply to any given situation, it turns out that those solutions grow. They get more sophisticated. People think them through more completely. They get behavioral detail when they think about them more completely. And turns out that they become more successful in addressing whatever those problems happen to have been that got us involved in the first place.
Okay. It sounds to me like that solution-focused interviewing goes hand in hand with trauma-informed practice.
That's a very good observation. Absolutely. Having somebody show up and wag their finger at you about what you've done wrong tends to increase anxiety, tends to be traumatic, especially when they wear a badge and come from the court system. And when people are in that heightened state of anxiety, they are not in a resourceful state. They're not in a place where they can think clearly and think creatively about solutions. And so by asking people when things were going better, or what they would like their future to look like if all was going well, it's like kicking them into a different gear cognitively, so that they are able to focus in a different direction and reduce the trauma that they're experiencing in the situation and increase the likelihood that they can mitigate that trauma going forward.
Great. So let's get into it. Tell me about the different types of solution-focused questions.
So for our purposes, sorry, I'm closing a reference that I had up there. For our purposes, we use essentially 5 categories of solution-focused questions here in the child welfare field. And I just want to put out there, anybody that's doing solution-focused brief therapy in a clinical setting may well have a more sophisticated and even more developed set of questions than what we use here for our child welfare casework. But we are having good luck using these 5 categories of questions in terms of teaching staff to use them and the results that we're getting from the families. So we separate them into 5 basic types of questions: exception questions, preferred future questions, coping questions, scaling questions, and position questions. And okay. I'd love to go through each one of those in turn if you'd like.
Sure. So should we start with the exception question?
Sure. We have on the screen, I believe, a handout that we use routinely in our trainings for helpful types of questions for working with families. And exceptions are at the top. So exception questions are an opportunity to focus away from the problem situation and onto periods of time when the family was functioning okay or well. So that if those, if they were in a gang, somebody was in a gang when they were a teenager, they got in trouble with the law, they got out, they worked for a while, and they got back involved with criminal behavior or substance abuse or some other difficult relationships that got us involved, domestic violence or otherwise, when the children came along. We want to know what happened in that space when there was no problem. What was the exception to the problem? So that space when they were working, perhaps, is something we might focus on. And I like to lead with these kinds of questions. Often it sounds something like, I realize that the county sent me out here to talk to you folks about this report that we need to deal with. But I'd like to start by learning a little bit about your family and when things have gone well. What are some of the best times that you guys have experienced as a family? Or what are some of the things that you're proud of as parents? And so that automatically gets someone that you're talking to sort for, well, when were things going well? What are some things that I'm proud of? What are some of my accomplishments? And so that's exception questions. Now, I think of them in 3 flavors, so to speak, and you can see those on the handout. That top one, when was a time that blank could have happened, but it didn't? So this is what I call the near-miss question. When was the time that you could have spanked your child because they were throwing a conniption fit in the middle of the grocery store, but you decided to do something different instead? Then I asked some middle-of-the-road exception questions, more like just when were some good times? When was a time that you felt successful as a parent, perhaps? But then the last category of question that I think is, I get good results by asking questions along this line, and that is, what are some of the things that you've done as a parent that you're most proud of? What are some of the things that were really big challenges that you're proud that you were able to navigate? And I think of those questions as values and priorities. That's how I get to values and priorities for a parent. And it's a very rich place to go early in an interview because you get an early sense for what do these parents care about. What do they think is important about raising their children?
What I hear then about an exception question is that it helps us to focus on strengths.
Yes, it definitely helps us focus. It helps us focus on strengths as the parent perceives them. Mm-hmm. Okay. And that is important information for us. So, for instance, let's say I asked somebody what are they most proud of, and they explained that their child was born with a severe medical condition. Mm-hmm. They teamed with the grandparents and a neighbor, as well as the other parent, to get them, months and months and months of treatment, right? And they were really pleased that they were able to mobilize and save the life of their child. If I ask them what are they most proud of, and they say something like, well, what I'm really happy with is I've discovered that I bought them a Game Boy, and every time I need them to get in the car or get their teeth brushed or get ready for school, I threaten to take the Game Boy away for a week. And they snap to and get the job done, right away. And I'm really pleased that I figured that out. Well, that's a different set of information about, where the parent is at in terms of their values and what do they see as most important in terms of, their interactions with their child. So, it's not just an excuse for everybody to go to a happy place. It's an opportunity for you to learn what the interior life of that parent is really like.
Okay. So what about the next type of solution-focused questions? I think they're called preferred future?
Preferred future questions. You'll often see in many textbooks, this is a favorite lead for solution-focused therapy, is this miracle question. If things are tough today, but if you went to bed tonight and you woke up tomorrow and that problem completely went away, how would you know? What would you like your future to look and sound and be like? And the idea here is to get people thinking about the future. Almost nothing improves without hope. Nobody changes their behavior. Nobody quits smoking unless they think quitting smoking is going to have a benefit to them, and usually that's a healthier future, right? But a lot of times our families are stuck on the true finding that was made on the petition, or the fact that that nosy neighbor down the block called the hotline on them in the first place, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is an opportunity for us to, again, get them to shift gears away from that particular part of the problem, which we'll get back to. We're not going to ignore it. But we do want to know what they would like things to look like for themselves and for their family into the future. And specifically, when we ask things like, what would it look like if this problem went away? We want to make sure we're asking them to tell us what would be happening as opposed to what would stop. So, a mannequin in the department store window could stop smoking, right? Or stop hitting, right? That's a goal that a mannequin could accomplish. We need to figure out is how the parent would like to hear themselves talk to their child, how their child would respond to them, how the other parent or some support would be, what would they do in order to be supportive. So we're looking for behavioral detail there. We'll get back to preferred future questions when we get down to position questions. So remind me to have a favorite kind of position question that has to do with preferred future that we'll talk about later.
Okay.
Oh, one more thing.
Sure.
That what do you see happening next is the last question that we have listed on the handout there. I'll be honest with you. There are plenty of times that question is an easy way for you to get the conversation back on track if it's veered off into the weeds somewhere. And you're curious to find out whether the parent is, or whoever you're talking to, is contemplating changing their behavior, or if they're really stuck on, well, what I'd like to see happening next is for you to leave my house, as opposed to, well, what I think needs to happen next is we need to figure out how to solve this. So I like to use that, what do you see happening next, as a check-in with whoever I'm talking to, whenever I'm concerned that the conversation maybe is not as focused as I'd like it to be.
Okay. So what I'd like to see happen next is let's talk about coping.
Okay.
What are the coping questions?
So coping questions are a nod to the fact that something's wrong or that there's challenges going on. And they are an opportunity to find out some of those strengths, some of those assets, some of those strategies that people are using to weather hard times. To have 3 children under the age of 3, all in diapers, and to be single, and not sure whether you're going to be able to keep your job or not, it seems like all of that would combine to be a pretty stressful situation. I'm wondering, how are some ways that you deal with it? How are some ways that you cope with the conditions that, the situation that you're in? It acknowledges that people are under stress. It acknowledges that people are having a tough time, but you're wanting to know how they're dealing with it because you want them to do more of it. You want them to do more of those coping. It's also important, I like to ask, how do you keep things from getting any worse than they are now? Because then that's even closer to the most problematic situation, and you're wanting to know how do they keep it from being a train wreck. And then in an age of safety organized practice, and here in California, the KDA court-ordered implementation for child and family teams to be formed, asking who else is around that helps you deal with these tough situations is a nice way to get into the process of finding out who's going to be part of the network. Who would they call when the chips are down 2 o'clock in the morning and they need a ride home or something like that? You want to start finding out, who's on their side in their mind that could possibly be part of the network later on.
Okay. What about scaling questions?
Yeah, scaling questions are as I have worked with my staff over the years, last 13 years, and both motivational interviewing and in solution-focused interviewing. For some reason, people have a harder time forming scaling questions than any of the others. And I think it's just a matter of practice. Scaling really requires that you set up a scale, 0 to 10, 1 to 10, whatever. I try to have my folks make the 10 the desired outcome. So if 10 is their children are perfectly safe and 0 is they're not. Or 10 is you've completely solved this problem and you're sailing off into the sunset, happily ever after, and 0 is you're stuck where you are right now. So you ask people where they're at on this scale, set it up for them, and ask them what kind of number they would come up with. Now, the beauty behind scaling questions is that a lot of us think in black and white terms, yes or no. Either someone's an alcoholic or they're sober. Somebody's either a good parent or they're a horrible parent. And especially families that are involved with child welfare are feeling pretty down about how the system is treating them, and perhaps if they are acknowledging their own behavior and the impact on the child, they're probably feeling pretty bad about themselves too. And this helps break up that yes-no dichotomy and get people to start examining the ambivalence that they feel in between. Because when you follow up with, if you ask them how safe they think their kids are, they came home today and they say they're a 7, how did they get to a 7? What added up to make it that high? And what's still an impediment to making it any higher? You want to hear from them those details. And it's those follow-on questions, quite frankly, that are more important than the scaling question itself.
Oh, yeah. So it really isn't the number that somebody responds to. It is getting the definition about what that number is to them.
That's right. That's right. How did they get to it?
And then tell me, you said that it's more important about the follow-up question. So what kind of follow-up questions would you ask?
So how did you get to that number is important. If I only hear a kind of a long list of problems, let's say I asked minor's attorney, right? On a scale of 0 to 10, 10 being they'd be perfectly safe. If we sent the kids home, how do you think it would be, for them? And let's say minor's attorney has got a fairly problem-saturated perspective, and they put it at a 3. And then they list all these reasons that's not a 10 and not any above, right? Then I will follow up with, so I hear that it's a 3. What makes it a 3 and not a 0? Which is an opportunity for them to look at, there are some strengths. There are some things going well. And they're not giving them much time of day, so they're kind of ignoring them in their decision-making process. And so I will listen for both sides. If somebody's got sort of rose-colored glasses on and they think it's an 8 and I think it's a 4, right? Mm-hmm. Then, and I need for them to address some of the problems that are still in place. Then I'll ask them what makes it an 8 and not a 10 so that I can hear their version of the problems. So the scaling question is, it cuts both ways. It's designed to help us flesh out the details on both ends of the spectrum. The other thing you can ask questions about, how important something is to people. You can ask separate questions about how confident they are that they could follow through. How strong do they feel in their ability to move that number? You can ask them their progress. What would you say the number was 6 months ago, and what would you say the number is now? And what are the things that you've been doing that moved it from a 4 to a 7 or something like that? There's a bazillion ways. And early in a case, when someone is at a certain number, I don't want to overwhelm them with lots and lots of work. I want them to just start making progress in the direction of solutions. So I frequently ask, so what's a little thing, just a little thing that you could do that would move it from, say, a 4 to a 5? And that way people not only, instead of like having to do everything in their case plan, maybe they pick the one part of their case plan that's going to have the biggest impact, and we get started there. So that's how that's how we use scaling questions.
Great. What about position questions?
Position questions are really an opportunity to get people to think about perspectives other than their own. Everybody on this planet tends to be a little egocentric in how we view the world. It's just how we experience the world. It's from our own perspective. And a lot of times it's helpful both to uncover strengths and to uncover problems that people aren't thinking about, to ask them, if your mom was here, what would they say you're best at? Or if your dad was here, what would he say he's worried about the grandkids? What would his perspective be? And a lot of times people will air stuff that they don't agree is a problem, but they know that it is something that the other person thinks is a problem. And this is it's an excellent way to get people to expand their perspective. One of the strategies, and I don't use this, at the beginning of a conversation, but as conversations, as interviews progress, I often find myself asking parents, when your child is grown up and all of this has passed, what kind of story do you want them to tell about how you handled this episode in your family's life? And that gets them to think about the future, create a preferred future from someone's perspective other than their own. And that often will encourage them to do some very careful thinking about, what would that story be? What would I like for my children to say? What are some values that I'd want them to reflect when they tell that story that are important to me? So the thing about position questions is you mix them up. If your child was here, let's say they say that the child would be an 8 on a safety scale. I might ask, well, if your child was here, who you beat for 20 minutes with a stick running around the house, right? If she was here, where do you think she would put herself and her safety on this scale? Often it's, maybe not as high, right? So what's the difference in her position and your position? What makes the difference? What do you think contributes to the difference in those numbers? The possible uses of position questions are limitless. And I often use them to help parents think about what the judge is concerned about or what the agency is concerned about, what minor's attorney is concerned about, as well as their children, so that we get more of the voice of the child in the conversation.
Okay. You said you had a favorite position question?
It's that, what kind of story would you like your kids to tell?
Okay.
That's
a good one.
Yeah, that one. I've heard. I heard another social worker say, Dad, if heaven forbid you were hit by a truck and killed tomorrow, what would your children say about what kind of dad you are? So that's not so much into the future. That was a little more focused on present day interactions. But there's a couple of different ways you can use that with, how do parents want their children to perceive them? And when children are small, and in some parts of our society where children are supposed to be, they're just supposed to obey and not herd, people are not accustomed to thinking about how their children will think of them. So it's useful.
Now, is there an order of how you use these questions together? There's no prescribed order. I think in a solution-focused therapy clinical setting, they often start with the preferred future and try to get at behavioral detail in order to flesh out that picture, make it more vivid and in color. I find in child welfare where people are very anxious and they're not there voluntarily. I'm showing up on their doorstep and they didn't ask me to be there. I find that the exception questions are the best place to start, and the broader, more value-based exception questions are the least threatening, easiest for people to answer, and they provide me valuable information about the overall mindset of parents. So I generally start there. I have good luck with that. I move into preferred future questions later on in the interview, and I usually save
for instance, the near miss questions. When was a time that you nearly smacked your child in the middle of the grocery store, but you decided not to? I usually save those for later when we're talking about either safety or scaling or the child's position or coping. You know, maybe children having tantrums in the grocery store is a recurring problem, and I find out that there are other times that they coped with that differently. Then I'll ask those exception questions there. So.
Okay. Well, and I know that you're a seasoned coach. How would a new coach use solution-focused questions when coaching in the field?
Well, I use them a lot to get a sense for where does a worker think a case is at, both in terms of working well and strengths, as well as their perception of the problems. And then I often will ask those workers position questions so that they give some thought to where the parents think they are and what the parents are most worried about. And this is a good way to get people thinking a little more critically about their casework, rather than just whatever the prevailing temperature or anxiety is in the office about cases. And I do frequently use, on a scale of safety, 10 being safe, where do they think the parent is now? And then behaviorally, and I often get jargon, and I do that. They give me the jargon, but I ask them for more behaviorally specific language about what parents would need to do to move up, just one number on that scale. So I use those a lot. A lot of times I'm asking workers, this family seems to be in a tough situation. What do you know about their coping strategies? Who have they told you helps them cope with difficult situations? So use them a lot to get people to think about where their families are at. And then usually near the end of the coaching session, I raise awareness about what are some of the kinds of questions that I've been asking, what kind of responses have they gotten from you, how have they helped you think through, how can you use those questions when you go out to the field and interface with this family next time. And sometimes we practice a few of those.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing your knowledge around solution-focused questions.
You're very welcome. I'm glad to do it. I am more convinced now than ever that everybody from the hotline, the person that takes the call at the hotline, to the investigator that goes to investigate, to the continuing services worker that works either on a family maintenance or family reunification part, to the supervisors, even the clerks and receptionists that interact with people when they come in the door. Everybody in our profession would make a more trauma-informed environment for families to grow and change if we all paid more attention to the kinds of questions that we ask and made more of them solution-focused.
That's a good note. Appreciate you spending the time with us today, Bill.
You bet. Thanks for having me back.
All right. Thank you. We'll be right back. You've been listening to The Coaching Corner from the Public Child Welfare Training Academy Radio through the Academy for Professional Excellence at San Diego State University School of Social Work. For more information about the Academy for Professional Excellence and the services we offer, please visit us on the web at theacademy.sdsu.edu. You can also subscribe to the Academy for Professional Excellence's YouTube channel by searching for the Academy SDSU. If you want to scale this podcast from a 10, that this is the best thing you've ever heard, to a 0 of I learned nothing, please drop us a line at jcoloma@mail.sdsu.edu and in the subject line, reference the title of this podcast. A special thank you to our guest today, Bill James, who gave us great knowledge about how to use solution-focused questions and how to use those in our coaching sessions. Please join us next time as we explore other topics in the child welfare arena. I'm your host, James Coloma, and now go out there and inspire and innovate our child welfare field.